นะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนะมัสสามิ Blessings, good evening from Bodhipala Monastery, where we're celebrating 6 years of Bodhipala Monastery, and also come together for Magha Puja, one of the Buddhist celebrations in the annual calendar. The day we recollect the occasion when the Buddha, at the first monastery in the Buddhist religion, the Veluvanarama, gave a teaching that we just chanted, the Ovada Patimokkha, to an assembly of, they say, 1,250 fully awakened arahants who came together without prior appointment. They just knew to arrive and came together on that occasion. So anniversaries and dates in calendars can be useful to us because draw our attention back to important events and help us to pause our life and take stock, make note of what's important perhaps, and also what is not important. So when we have an anniversary of a monastery, especially a new monastery, somewhere that was recently didn't exist as a monastery, and then now it does exist, well, brings up many positive emotions, particularly gratitude and appreciation to the people who offered the land for the monastery and those who have helped build it up, and then of course to the Sangha who live here and the lay supporters who support the monastery in an ongoing way. A lot of gratitude because now we have this beautiful monastery here in South Australia. It's a branch monastery in the Sangha of Ajahn Chah. So it's really through Ajahn Chah's amazing Bharami that he inspired so many foreigners to come and practice the Dhamma. Many became monks and nuns, some just lay practitioners, but they've gone on to build monasteries around the world such as this, make offerings of land and property, and then support the building of the monasteries. And of course it's the Bharami of the Buddha. The Buddha lived over 2,500 years ago, and that first monastery, Veluvanarama, the bamboo grove, the squirrel sanctuary, you can still visit it today. It's on the edge of Rajgir town. That's a reflection in itself. In the time of the Buddha, they say Rajgir was a thriving center of a kingdom. There was a king living there, Bimbisara, and it was a very bustling town, so they say, center of trade, finance, local crafts, industry, agriculture, sitting between a number of important, significant mountains that all had names, and various events took place on these different hills, mountains surrounding. It's still a town today, but in terms of significance, it's, you might say, that significance in, say, modern day India has dwindled. It's much less important, perhaps much smaller than in the time of the Buddha. And that reminds us of the impermanence of things. Towns and cities can grow and shrink over long periods of time. In one lifetime, maybe your local town or city is always growing. Like Adelaide or Melbourne tend to be growing. The suburbs keep expanding, new buildings, new things. But over a longer period of time, maybe hundreds of years, towns can shrink and even disappear. And with it, monasteries, so there's no longer a Buddhist monastery at Wanuwana, but the park and the area is still there. It's been kind of marked out as a historical monument and still has a very peaceful energy. There's still bamboo, there's still pond, still certain pleasant characteristics, and if you go and meditate and chant there, you can chant the Awada Patimokkha that we just chanted, recollect the Buddha and his teachings. Still a valuable place, but probably not as thriving as in the time of the Buddha. So that's both a reflection, even a warning, isn't it? Monasteries can grow and disappear too. So we want our monastery here, Bodhipala Monastery, to grow, to thrive, or it thrives through the practice of the Sangha and the laity supporting. So we come together on these occasions to practice, to listen to Dhamma, to chant, to meditate. And that's the heart of our monastery, it's the practice that we do. The buildings, the grounds are important, and we have to look after them and develop them maybe, but most importantly is looking after our hearts and minds. When we first purchased this monastery land, there was a concern because at that time South Australia was going through a drought for many years and was very dry. Drier than it is now. This year is quite dry, but previously it was even drier than this. And nowadays you have the luxury of Google Earth. You can look at a property from the sky, from the satellite picture, and zooming in on this local area, Mount Pleasant and the lofty ranges, the Adelaide Hills. What stood out about this property was the water. Big pond at the front, which had, at that time, even more water birds and different kinds of birds living there, because it was the last big pond in the region, the last big lake in the region. Everything else seemed to have dried up on the farms and properties because of the drought, but there was water here, which is a very encouraging sign to the monks and lay people that there's still water here even in a drought. And that always brought up the reflection from Ajahn Chah and even from the Buddha that you're practicing the Dhamma, you're seeking and aiming for the truth, because that liberates our mind. And it's just like seeking water. If there's no water on the surface of the ground, then you have to seek down into the ground, dig down. But if you've ever been involved with looking for water in the ground, sometimes it's hit and miss. But if you keep digging, and particularly if you keep digging deep enough, then sooner or later you'll hit some water in the ground. And when we moved into this property, the owner showed us not really a secret spring, but it was not very obvious to anyone because it's hidden in the rocks in the hills of this property. And so not many people knew about it, but he took us up to see this spring that even after a 10-year drought still had water coming up. It was obviously popular with the native animals, big and small, birds. They had a lot of reeds growing up in the water, and that was a sign of the underground water here as well. And the spring had water bubbling up, and then water underground was flowing underground down the valley to where the pond, the lake at the front of the monastery it's always got water in it, even in a drought. And that made me think of Ajahn Chah, this teaching. If you keep digging, you keep looking, and you don't give up, if you're patient enough, you put enough effort in, well, you'll find water. In the same way, if you keep putting effort into your practice, you'll find peace and wisdom, which purifies your mind from mental defilements, the cause of suffering, and you'll reach the end of suffering. The important bit is not to give up and to keep putting effort into the practice, just as you have to do that to find water. And the Buddha said the same when he gave this teaching, Ovada Patimokkha. Abandon evil, unwholesome mental states, cultivate the wholesome, purify your mind. And that all takes effort and continuous practice. You have to keep doing it, because it's like, certainly at first in your practice, it seems like there's an endless store of unwholesome, evil mental states coming up, big and small. And what do they do to the mind? Well, we say they proliferate the mind. They lead on to endless thinking, negative emotions, unpleasant experiences, and of course speech and action that reflect that or come from that. So Ajahn Chah and many teachers point out that if you watch your mind when you start to meditate, you're bringing up mindfulness, you're paying attention to your mind. What do you observe? We observe this proliferation, the apparently endless thinking going on, one thing after another. And particularly under the influence of mental defilements rooted in greed, anger, delusion. They think the mind constantly seems to be spreading outwards and moving off from a point, creating more and more suffering. We call this mental proliferation. One of the ways the Buddha talked about these mental defilements, he called them the akati, the biases of mind, or even the prejudices of the mind. This mental behavior, this activity of endlessly thinking, worrying, reacting to things, forming loves and hates, these are the prejudices of the mind, the akati. So akati, or bias, prejudice, rooted in love, desire, attraction, rooted in hate and aversion, rooted in fear, anxiety, and then rooted in just delusion, not knowing, not understanding, or misunderstanding. These are the four biases of mind that feed this endless proliferation, the endless thinking. And the Buddha talked about this a lot in many different ways, but this is something you actually have to learn about when you meditate. It's not just a theory that you hear from the Buddha or read in the book, but something you have to observe for yourself. What's going on? If I'm experiencing a lot of endless thinking, what is the nature of that thinking? Because it's not all the same, is it? It's not all rooted in one particular subject or theme. But you could classify your thinking maybe into these four main areas: greed, aversion, delusion, fear. As you meditate, you'll notice what's going on. That's the aim, if you're mindful. Of course, when you're under the influence of the biases, the mental defilements, you don't notice things because you're caught into the proliferation, the endless thinking. When you're worrying, you perhaps don't realize you're worrying. Not much you can do about it. You're stuck in it, and it seems real and as if it's always there. It's just the way it is. You don't see anything else, perhaps. Or when you're angry, that's all you know, so that's what you're believing in and following. Or when you're caught into greed, attachment, or lust, that's all you know. But the Buddha is saying, well, actually, it's not always like this. These are mental defilements or biases of mind that keep coming up, sure, but they're not the mind. They're like the contents of the mind, and they're not permanent, and they're not a self. It's not like they just always exist in a kind of fixed way. They come and go according to the causes and conditions. So one of the biggest causes and conditions is a lack of mindfulness and a lack of insight, which is why we practice to develop mindfulness and insight. This is abandoning the unwholesome, cultivating the wholesome. And it takes effort, so sometimes we put in more effort than others. There's another way you can look at it. If you're suffering, maybe it's because you're not putting much effort into abandoning the roots of your suffering. Greed, anger, delusion, or fear. Or if you're caught into doubt, what shall I do in my practice? Well, maybe you look at your mind, what's going on, and introduce the remedies for the suffering and the mental proliferation. So you're angry, well, put effort into introducing mindfulness and then maybe loving kindness, tolerance, forgiveness, acceptance. There's different aspects to the practice of loving kindness, but it will help you to abandon the unwholesome bias of anger and what it does to the mind. Lust and attraction is overcome by contemplating the unattractive. Fear is overcome by contemplating, bringing up something that doesn't bring you fear. So if you don't know what to contemplate when you're overcome by fear and the mind is just thinking, stuck in a mood of fear, well, the Buddha said, think of the Buddha. The Buddha doesn't inspire fear. The Buddha inspires peace, clarity, mindfulness, wisdom, compassion. So if you're afraid or anxious, think of the Buddha, and that can calm you right down. If you're deluded, mindfulness itself is the best antidote. Mindfulness, clear comprehension. When you're mindful, paying attention, you're clearly comprehending what's going on, what you're doing. Delusion tends to disappear. You can use this simple reflection over and over again, cultivating the wholesome, abandoning the unwholesome, dealing with the biases of mind. Particularly in a monastery, why do we build monasteries? Why do we have monasteries? Because they're places where you can practice this very well. You come into a monastery, say in the Ajahn tradition, you come in, you learn how to keep precepts. In a monastery, the basic requirement is 8 precepts. Out in the world, maybe 5 precepts is your normal goal or what you aspire to in daily life. 8 precepts is the basic or minimum standard for a monastic training when you're in the monastery. We don't eat after midday, say. We don't sleep on luxurious beds. We don't have entertainments and music and sport and videos and all that. We don't kill, we don't steal, we're celibate. These are the basics for living in a monastery. Already this brings up the quality of nekama, abandoning certain aspects of sensual desire. So already this is shaping your practice, abandoning greed, anger and delusion on one level, particularly in your actions and your speech. So this is already remedying some of these biases that you've picked up and accumulated through a lifetime living in the world. And lay the foundation for the practice of mindfulness and the developing deeper understanding, insight and wisdom that will help to really remove these biases. And what is a bias? It's sort of an accumulated habit of mind that keeps reinforcing itself when we're not mindful and aware. So we keep attaching to certain perceptions. If you're angry, it's because you keep thinking of the negative side of something. What makes you angry? The fault, the imperfection, whatever you find annoying. And because this world is so varied, and people's personalities and their karma is so varied, sometimes even good things can make you angry. Maybe out of jealousy or cynicism or just annoyance that something is good when you see yourself is not good. Maybe even that's a bias. Or sometimes beauty can make us angry. Maybe it's beauty that's not ours, and so we get angry because it's not ours. We want it and we can't get it. And you'll see your mind switches very quickly between these different biases. Love and then hate and then love, fear and then delusion, swirling around. And so the experience you have in your mind all the time, once you're meditating and practicing mindfulness, particularly in a quiet place like this, you notice it's just one bias after another. Our suffering is like that, isn't it? We want things, but sometimes we don't get what we want. So you want a certain kind of comfort or pleasure. When you get it, you're happy, but that just reinforces the bias, maybe the attachment is reinforced, so it only gets worse. When you don't get what you want, you get angry. And you notice that in a monastery, you don't get everything you want because it's a monastery. It's not a place where it's not your home where you just set it up the way you want. You have to conform, you have to follow the routine, you have to eat the food that's offered, you have to put up with the accommodation you're given, the place, the people, the training. It's not necessarily what you want. So your biases are immediately triggered, so you get aversion coming up. People say things you don't agree with, do things you don't like. But it helps you to see your biases, that's the point. So sometimes this kind of suffering that comes up when you don't get what you want, or you get what you don't want, helps you to understand your own mind better and see how that causes you suffering. When you follow the biases, even the smallest thing becomes big, doesn't it, in your mind. And maybe you like a certain brand of product, whether it's clothing or food or furniture or anything that you use. But in a monastery you won't necessarily get the brand or the product or the taste or the smell that you want. In monastery, like the things you use in monasteries, you often use very plain kinds of soap to wash, because we don't go for a lot of perfumed products or soap powder for your clothing, or soap for your body. You often use very plain brands. But that's not always what you want, is it? Maybe part of your mind wants something more luxurious, more perfume, more interesting, more stimulating. Same with food. There's food that you want and like, but maybe you don't see that for days on end. Same with drinks and allowables. Sometimes you get what you like, sometimes you don't. But what does it do to your mind? You observe the biases of the mind at work. So if you're in a monastery where it's strict, and you're following the 8 precepts, and maybe you don't get, after your meal, you don't get anything until maybe once a day in the evening, some juice or something to drink in the evening. Maybe there will even be periods where you just think about food or drink. One main meal a day, one drink in the evening, and then there'll be times when you think, I wonder what I can get. You have to be the one who's mindful and see that, what it's doing to your mind, the desire. Getting what you want, Ajahn Chah used to say, makes you stupid, because you get what you want, you stop contemplating, you're satisfied. not getting what you want may actually make you wiser, because you see the suffering of your biases. That's working over and over again with food, drink, people, views and opinions, what people say, what they do, their behavior, the weather, the accommodation, the activities, the job you're assigned. Maybe you're assigned a job you don't really like. So why can't I do that job? That's the one I like. And your mind starts proliferating, thinking up all this stuff. But this is just the effect of the akati, the four akati on the mind, making something small into something big. Whether you get the brand of tea or coffee or juice that you like or you don't, in the end it's still just tea or coffee or juice. But nowadays we're so obsessed with brands and contents and fashion in every aspect of our life, because our economy in the world has developed to a point where there is a lot available. So we become very choosy and picky. But in a monastery, it's not like that, is it? You can't choose much. You just get what you want, or get what you're given within what's available every day. So you'll see, if you're watching, you'll see your mind at work. Oh, I don't want this, I like that. The things we like, what does the bias of the mind, the prejudices of mind means? You start to hoard and accumulate. The Buddha said, greed leads to hoarding, accumulating, keeping bags of stuff that you want. The opposite of letting go and giving away. So actually you're creating more suffering for yourself. The more you follow the bias of mind, the more you hoard, the more you seek out the thing you like. And then the stronger your aversion when you don't get what you want. It could be people. You want people that think the same as you, work the same as you, do the same things as you, talk the same way. You want people, if you like quiet and peace and quiet, well then people who talk a lot you get annoyed with. If you like socializing, then people who don't talk you get annoyed with. That's the bias of the mind. Making small things into big things, thinking too much about something very ordinary maybe. I don't like this, I don't like that, I want this, I want that. The Dhamma goes the opposite way. The Dhamma of mindfulness, insight into impermanence, not self, what does that do? It makes the big things into small things again, shrinks them back down. Oh, it's just food. Oh, it's just a few words from a person. Oh, it's just temperature change. Oh, it's just a feeling of tiredness, or a feeling like this, some aches and pains. When you bring the Dhamma in, you pay attention with mindfulness and you use some insight. It's just a thought, just a feeling, just arising, ceasing. It's not that good, it's not that bad. Then a lot of the proliferation and the strong emotions start to sink back again. Makes the big things into little things. But if you give up the practice, you stop paying attention with mindfulness, you just start believing every thought, well, even the smallest thing becomes magnified, becomes a big thing. And say you live in a kuti, you've got the same hut every day, over and over again. You start to notice more and more about that hut, what you like about it, what you don't like about it. This is right, but that's wrong, I need this, I need that. It can start to become a big thing. I remember Ajahn Sumedho was saying when he was at Wapapong, when he was a fairly junior monk with Ajahn Chah, and then George Sharp came from England to talk to Luang Por Chah about sending monks to start a monastery in England. Ajahn Sumedho said, better give him a really good kuti, look after him, he's come a long way, travelled a long way, you've got to be kind to him, compassionate, which makes sense. But Ajahn Chah's style was always, if you're new, the newest arrival, whoever you are, however important, rich, whatever your background is, you just get the normal thing, which means you get the last kuti that's available. All the good kutis and the better kutis, the stronger kutis, the bigger kutis have been taken, so you get the worst kuti, because it's usually the one that nobody wants. It's the empty one. So he was given the smallest, mouldiest, darkest little kuti in the corner, falling apart kuti, which is very common at Ajahn Chah's monastery, because someone's got to live in it, so it's always the more recent arrival. And George Sharp didn't complain. He's probably just happy to have a roof over his head in the forest. Ajahn Sumedho had to deal with his own bias. We should give him something better. And you see that coming up all the time in monasteries. You want something different than what you've got. Different schedule, different accommodation, different food. And then you bring it back to your body and mind. You want a different body, maybe. You want a body that's healthier, stronger, younger, less aches and pains, more bias. You want a mind that's different. You don't want to have to deal with all this mental proliferation. Well, if that's true, you have to go back to the mindfulness, the here and now, and start paying attention to what's coming up and recognize bias as bias. It's delusion. It's all rooted in delusion. What we tend to do is just react to our own mind. So we don't want our own mind, so we become even more upset. Angry because we're angry, angry because we're greedy, angry because we're deluded, upset, thinking even more, which becomes another bias. So you're endlessly getting caught into prejudice, bias, liking, disliking, endlessly following preferences. And it's that endlessness that kind of wears you down if you're not careful. If you stop practicing, you feel like, oh, this is just the way it is and there's no way out. I don't have the barami, I don't have the way to practice and any good qualities to practice. So people will easily give up. When you give up, you just go to distraction, which is more bias, more prejudice taking over the mind, but you're not doing anything about it. So it's reinforcing the very problem you're trying to get away from. There's one way of practicing, isn't it? Look at your mind and see where you're maybe magnifying or expanding or proliferating small things, making them into big things. When it becomes really big, it spills out into our speech. So our bias is always also affecting our actions and our speech. What we say, what we do is coming from the biases of the mind half the time. When it comes from Dhamma, there's no problem. When you're paying attention, you're mindful of your precepts, you're mindful of your mood, but you're not giving into it. You're not giving into the bias because you're mindful. Well, your behavior reflects that. Your behavior becomes more restrained, peaceful. Doesn't matter whether you're being with people that you like or dislike, whether you're with food that you dislike or like, the weather is hot or cold. Doesn't matter, because you're now acting with Dhamma. You're mindful, you're restrained, you're reflective. You can actually separate your mind from the biases. When the mindfulness becomes really continuous, one-pointed, well, you attain samadhi. Which is like when your mind detaches from the biases or puts them to sleep. They may still be down there, deeply rooted in your consciousness, but when your mindfulness becomes more continuous, then the biases do not manifest for a while, so you get a nice rest from them. And then you can look back at them from a place of detachment. You can see a bias or prejudice in the mind as that. Love as love, or attachment as attachment, hatred as hatred. See it for what it is, and then wisdom can root it out and actually let go of it for good, maybe. What is the most deeply rooted delusion and bias of mind? Well, it's the love of self, isn't it? We love ourselves. We're always siding with ourselves, following these biases. So bias, whatever bias you have, tends to reinforce other biases, because we're always following what we love and like, and what we hate we try to push away, what we love we try to get. But when your mind becomes more peaceful in samadhi, there's continuous mindfulness. We say it's empty of self temporarily, so then you can look back at what you call the self and see what it's made up of. It's really a collection of bias, prejudice, thinking, delusions, loves and hates. When you separate that out, what's left? There's only Dhamma, isn't it? Mindfulness, insight, wholesome states of mind. And this is a process, it's a process of purification. This is what the Buddha taught us to do. Abandon the unwholesome, cultivate the wholesome, purify your mind. If you set your heart on that act, that job, that task, then you're following what the Buddha said. You can use the place to practice to do that. And then it's only a matter of time, whether it's one day, 1 year, one lifetime, many lifetimes, it doesn't matter. The important thing is to be doing that practice, abandoning the unwholesome, cultivating the wholesome, purifying your mind. Talking earlier today, someone like, when we first arrived here in this property, all the buildings were old and run down, the windows weren't very good, doors weren't very good, so had all these millipedes would come in from the rocks and come into the buildings, like use them like caves. If you go to caves, you often get millipedes and other kind of cave-dwelling bugs. So this monastery was full of millipedes, all the buildings were. They come and go, and sometimes you get hundreds of millipedes on one wall. And when you arrived, first time you thought, oh, am I going to have to live with millipedes forever? So your prejudice, your bias comes up if you don't like millipedes or creepy crawlies. But you have no choice, you have to just get on with it and practice with them. Gradually over the years, made the buildings better, put in proper windows and doors. Now the millipedes tend to stay outside, you hardly see them. You can't come in. Maybe future generations of monks will become prejudiced again. They won't like millipedes. If they see millipedes, they'll get upset. One generation learnt to live with them. Now the current generation doesn't have to bother with them. Life is like that, isn't it? You're constantly tested, and maybe you overcome the test by wisdom, or maybe the conditions change. That's life. You can't always control the conditions. The important thing is to learn and see where your prejudices are, where your biases are, and remedy them. You remedy the anger with metta, remedy the greed with insight into impermanence, not self, the unattractiveness of the objects of your greed. Practice mindfulness, remedy those delusions when you keep believing everything you think. Bring your mind to one-pointedness, and then all the biases are exposed. So maybe I'll leave these reflections with you tonight, and we'll end the meeting in a moment.
Sadhu